Hello and welcome to Reasonable. In today's video, we will try to find out to what degree Western nations are depending on China for critical products and resources. The idea that China produces most of the goods that we use on a day-to-day basis is a belief that is held by many people in the West. In fact, China is often being referred to as the factory of the world, and just think about how many times you've heard somebody say, "Everything is made in China," or a similar phrase. That being said, let's try to find out how much of that is true, and to what degree Western nations are relying on China for critical products and resources. For the sake of time, we will only analyze the US's and the European Union's dependency on China. First, let's look at the total value of the export of China compared to other countries. In this chart from the statistics portal Statista.com, we can see the total volume in US dollars of China's exports compared to other leading countries. As you can see, China was the biggest exporter of the world with a total value of more than $3.5 trillion in 2022. The US came in second place with about $2 trillion, followed by Germany with $1.6 trillion. And here's a world map of the World Trade Organization that visualizes the ranking of countries in total export value. This map also estimates China's total export to be around $3.5 trillion. However, the World Trade Organization estimates that the total export value of the US is actually around $2.1 trillion. Last but not least, this list provided by the World Bank also reports China as the biggest exporter of the world, although the total values differ from the data of the World Trade Organization and Statista.com. Another relevant metric to look at is the manufacturing output of China. The manufacturing output is the output of all factories across a country. According to the United Nations Statistics Division, China is the world's leading manufacturing power. China accounted for 28.7% of global manufacturing output in 2019. That puts China 10 percentage points ahead of the United States, which used to have the world's largest manufacturing sector, until China overtook it in 2010. In 2019, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of China's total economic output, about $4 trillion. In other words, saying China is the factory of the world may be factually incorrect, but it is responsible for almost one-third of the global manufacturing output. However, we must not forget that much of this manufacturing output is actually for domestic use. China inhabits about 1.4 billion people, and it has set ambitious economic growth targets for the future. Now we will briefly dive into what resources, products, and services China is actually exporting. Let's take a look at a visualization provided by TradingEconomics.com that is based on data from the United Nations Comtrade database. This graph shows that electronic equipment is the #1 export industry in China in 2022, and it accounted for about 22% of its total export, valued at $954 billion. In second place are machinery, nuclear reactors and boilers valued at $551 billion, followed by vehicles other than railway vehicles valued at $150 billion. Furthermore, China exported about $143 billion in plastics, $130 billion in furniture, lighting signs and prefabricated buildings, and $110 billion in articles of iron or steel. And here's a different list that consists of specific products instead of industries, provided by the Observatory of Economic Complexity. The values shown next to the products represent billion US dollars. Now let's take a look at the countries that China is exporting to. This graph from TradingEconomics.com shows the top export countries in dollar value. As you can see, the US is the #1 export country with a total export value of $582 billion in 2022. The second biggest export market is actually Hong Kong with a total value of $297 billion, followed by Japan with $172 billion. Other important export markets are South Korea, Vietnam, India, the Netherlands, and Germany. Now that we have covered that China is in fact the largest exporter of the world and what its biggest export markets are, we will try to find out if there are any specific resources, industries, or products where China is dominating the global market, and more specifically Western markets. Let's start with a chart published by the Council on Foreign Relations and based on the data of the United Nations Comtrade database. This chart shows the different types of goods that the US imported from China in 2021. As you can see, Electronics and machinery were by far the leading import goods from China, followed by toys and games, textiles, plastics and rubbers, metals, furniture, and chemical products. Furthermore, up to 80% of the basic components used in U.S. drugs, known as active pharmaceutical ingredients, come from China and India, though the exact dependence remains unknown since no reliable AP registry exists. China is also the second largest exporter of biologics and the prime source of medical devices per the FDA. In some cases, it appears that India is a prime source of a key import, but that masks the fact that India sources up to 75% of its own pharma ingredients from China. Also, China supplies about 60% of all rare earth elements worldwide, according to the International Energy Agency. And not only that, China is actually responsible for refining up to 90% of rare earth elements worldwide and about 60 to 70% of lithium and cobalt. Now we are going to take a look at some data on the European Union's dependency on imports from China. MERIX, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, published an extensive report on Europe's economic interdependence with China in November 2020. The report concludes that the EU's overall critical strategic dependence on China is limited. There are 103 product categories in electronics, chemical, minerals, metals, and pharmaceutical and medical products in which the EU has a critical strategic dependence on imports from China. However, the vast majority of these are concentrated in technologically less sophisticated areas of the value chain. And here is an interesting image provided by the Mercator Institute for China Studies that shows the areas where the EU critically depends on China. This image also lists China's global market share in these areas. According to this image, the EU is highly dependent on imports from China for various active pharmaceutical ingredients, antibiotics, chemicals, and electronics. Some of this was actually confirmed by Ursula von der Leyen, the current president of the European Union. In her speech to the Mercator Institute for China Studies and the European Policy Center in March 2023, von der Leyen said the following: "The aim is to be able to produce at least 40% of the clean tech that we need for the green transition, such as solar, onshore, and offshore wind, renewable energy in the broadest sense, batteries and storage, heat pumps and grid technology. But to achieve this goal, we will also need more independence and diversity when it comes to the key inputs needed for our competitiveness. We know this is an area where we rely on one single supplier, China, for 98% of our rare earth supply, 93% of our magnesium, and 97% of our lithium." So, what can we conclude? Is almost everything we use on a day-to-day basis made in China? And to what degree are Western countries dependent on China for critical products and resources? The simple answer is no. Obviously, China does not literally make everything. While it's safe to say that China can still be considered the factory of the world in terms of manufacturing output, the areas where China dominates global markets of critical products and resources are limited but significant. We can confidently conclude that the West is indeed highly dependent on China when it comes to critical products and resources such as rare earth metals, pharmaceutical ingredients, and electronics. These are all extremely important products and resources for day-to-day life in Western countries. Next to that, China obviously also exports a huge amount of consumer goods that are not necessarily critical, but arguably have improved the quality of life in Western countries throughout the years. However, it is important to understand that this works both ways. First of all, China is dependent on Western consumer markets to ensure its targeted economic growth. Secondly, China also imports critical products and resources from the US and the European Union. European machinery, specialized instruments, materials, and components are crucial for China's manufacturing strength, not only in low-tech, but increasingly also in high-tech. For example, access to the Dutch semiconductor equipment manufacturer ASML is vital for China's ambitions to build up a competitive semiconductor industry. Lastly, we must also mention that the US as well as the European Union have been implementing steps to decrease its economic dependency on China and will most probably continue to do so the coming years. Thanks for watching this video. Let us know what you think of our analysis in the comment section, and make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos and updates.